David was sitting on the steps of the school entrance, his feet swinging anxiously as he watched the gate. The bell had rung almost an hour ago, and now the courtyard was filled with laughter and hugs. Parents arrived one by one, and children ran into their arms with expressions of pure joy and relief. Little David watched the scene, his heart pounding. He held a colorful drawing in his hands that he had made especially for his dad. In it, they were together, father and son, holding hands with a big smiling sun in the background. Above, in large, slightly crooked letters, he had written, "For the best dad in the world." He smiled, imagining how happy his dad would be to see the drawing. His father had promised to pick him up that special Friday, something that rarely happened. "A surprise," he had said. As David waited, he saw his friends excitedly run towards their parents. The laughter and shouts of "Daddy!" echoed through the courtyard. One by one, everyone left, holding hands, their voices blending with conversations about what they'd do over the weekend. "Bye, David, see you Monday." One of his classmates waved enthusiastically before disappearing into the crowd. One of his closest friends, Timmy, stopped in front of David, his backpack hanging from one shoulder and a curious smile on his face. "Hey, David, you're still here. Is your dad coming to get you today?" David lifted his chin, pride gleaming in his young eyes. "Yes, he is," he replied confidently. "He said he had a surprise for me. He said we'd go out together. Just me and him." Timmy's smile widened. "Wow, that's awesome. My dad also promised to take me fishing tomorrow. I bet you guys are going to have a great time." David nodded, trying to ignore the pang of envy at Timmy's words. Being with his father wasn't something common for him, but today David was sure everything would be different. "Yes, it's going to be amazing." Timmy waved again and ran towards his father, who had just arrived. David watched as the boy leaped into his dad's arms, laughing loudly. Timmy's father picked him up, and they walked off together, talking and laughing about their fishing trip. David remained seated, his eyes fixed on the iron gate, waiting to see his father's face at any moment. Every time a car stopped, he stood up slightly, his heart full of hope, but no one came to get him. When the first streetlights came on, anxiety began to give way to a feeling of discomfort. The courtyard was nearly empty. Only a few teachers spoke softly in the distance as he continued to wait. David looked at the drawing in his hands. The colorful lines were starting to crumple under the pressure of his fingers. Finally, he saw a familiar car appear in the distance. Relief washed over him in an instant smile. But when the door opened, it wasn't his father who stepped out, it was his mother. The expression on her face didn't show the joy he had hoped to see. Instead, there was a shadow of exhaustion and something David couldn't immediately identify. Sadness. She approached slowly, her steps hesitant as if she were walking on glass. "Mom, where's Dad?" "Did he forget about me?" David asked, his voice trembling under the weight of disappointment. His mother stopped in front of him and crouched down, bringing herself to his level. Her eyes were glassy, and when she touched his shoulder, David felt her hand tremble slightly. "Sweetheart, Dad couldn't come." David took a step back, confusion etched on his small face. "But he promised. He said he'd be here. He promised, Mom." His voice rose a little, as if his words could somehow make everything right again. His mother took a deep breath, and for a moment it seemed like she was going to break down. But she forced herself to remain steady. "Dad isn't coming back, my love. He's gone." David stood still, his eyes locked on his mother's, waiting for her to explain, to say something that would make sense. But the silence that followed was like an avalanche he couldn't stop. Her words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over. He looked at the drawing he was holding, now just a crumpled piece of paper in his hands. His voice came out as a trembling whisper. "I hate him, Mom. I'll never forgive him." His mother tried to reach for him, but David stepped back. The drawing slipped from his fingers and was carried away by the wind, sliding down the sidewalk until it disappeared into the darkness. The present merged with the past, like a suffocating veil, bringing David back to reality. He found himself once again in his lonely apartment. The envelope, with the same handwriting he vaguely recognized, was in front of him. He took a deep breath and picked up the letter with trembling fingers. The words seemed to vibrate on the page. as if they carried the full weight of everything that had happened. "Dear son, I know it's late, but I need to ask for your forgiveness. If there's still a chance for us to meet, please call me. I'm going through a hard time and would like to see you before it's too late." David closed his eyes, and rage consumed him. How dare he? How could he try to come back into his life after so many years? "Dear son," he murmured to himself, feeling his chest burn. "Now you call me son? After all these years?" He crushed the letter in his fist, as if he could destroy the words of his father's regret with the simple act of squeezing it. He threw it in the trash and stood there, staring at the bin as if it were a bottomless pit. What had he expected to feel? Relief? No, that wasn't what he felt. He felt a void as deep as the disappointment that had consumed him since childhood. He picked up the letter again, unfolding it with trembling hands. The words, "I'm sorry, and I'd like to see you," were like daggers stabbed into his heart. But before he could give in to the temptation to reread them, he tore the letter into pieces and threw it away for good. Nothing changed. That feeling of emptiness only grew stronger. All he wanted was to forget. But forgetting seemed impossible. At home that night, David sat on the couch, the TV off, and the silence around him was almost deafening. Anna, his wife, watched him from a distance, hesitant. Finally, she gathered the courage to approach and sat beside him. "I know you received a letter today." Her voice was a whisper, filled with concern. David didn't even look her way. "I don't want to talk about it." Anna took a deep breath but didn't back away. "That's okay. I just want you to know that I'm here if you need me." David turned to her, and Anna saw something in his eyes that left her frozen. It was a mix of anger and pain, something deep and devastating. "You don't understand. He left me, Anna. And now he wants forgiveness, like that could erase everything. I'll never forgive him. Never." Hannah reached for his hand, but David pulled away, standing abruptly. "You want me to forgive him? No, I can't. I don't want you to do it for him, David. I want you to do it for you, for us, because you're destroying yourself, and you're destroying us along with you." David looked at her, the anger starting to fade, giving way to something he couldn't name. Maybe sadness, maybe despair. He didn't know. I can't, Anna." Silence fell between them like an impenetrable wall. Anna sighed, standing up slowly. "Just think about it, please." She left, and David was alone again. He looked at the pieces of the letter in the trash can. A solitary tear escaped, but he wiped it away angrily. Nothing seemed to ease the burden he carried, nothing. David stood in the kitchen, sipping on a cup of cold coffee while staring out the window. It was a Saturday morning, but contrary to what one would expect, the house was eerily quiet. Sophie, his 6-year-old daughter, was playing alone in the backyard, her occasional laughter echoing faintly through the house. Anna was in the bedroom, likely avoiding yet another argument. David sighed, the bitter coffee sliding down his throat like a reminder of his own bitterness. He couldn't recall exactly when things began to change. Maybe it had been gradual, a silent distance growing between him and Anna. First, it was the small arguments, then the uncomfortable silences, until her very presence seemed to weigh on him. He picked up his phone and opened a work email. He knew he should be spending the day with his family, but the thought of diving into more paperwork and reports seemed easier than facing the realities he preferred to ignore. He was about to start typing a message when Sophie's little voice interrupted him. "Daddy, come play with me." David looked up and saw his daughter standing at the kitchen door, her brown curls framing her smiling face, and her eyes shining with the excitement of someone who believes the world is full of promises. For a moment, he hesitated. He should say yes. Spend time with her. But the pressure in his chest grew, the same feeling of weight and inadequacy that he felt every time his daughter asked for more than he could give. "Sophie, Daddy's busy right now. I promise I'll play with you later, okay?" Her smile faded a little, but Sophie just nodded, forcing an understanding expression that hit him right in the gut. "Okay, Daddy. I'll wait." She turned and went back to the yard. David watched his daughter walk away and hated himself for not being able to cross the kitchen and join her. Sophie was just a child, and he was the absent father. The thought deeply disturbed him. He began to remember all the times he had waited for his own father and felt the same emptiness and disappointment he now saw in his daughter's eyes. Frustrated with himself, he threw the coffee mug into the sink harder than he meant to, the sound of porcelain breaking the silence of the house. "You're becoming just like him." Anna's voice came from the hallway, soft but full of sadness. David turned and saw her standing at the kitchen entrance. Her eyes were dark and worried, as if she were witnessing the repetition of a pattern she didn't know how to stop. "Don't start, Anna." She crossed her arms, staring at him. "You're making the same mistakes, David. You're pulling away from us, hiding behind work. I know you're hurting, but don't you see you're doing the same thing he did to you?" David felt his blood boil, anger and fear intertwining like serpents in his chest. "I'm not him, Anna, and I never will be." "Really?" She took a step forward, her voice growing firmer. "How many times have you promised to be here and weren't? How many times has she asked you to play and you said you were busy? Do you think that's any different?" Every word was like a blow, hitting him straight on. He opened his mouth to argue but found nothing. Because deep down, he knew she was right. He saw her expression change from anger to something more painful. "I see how much this is destroying you, David, but I can't let it destroy our family too." Those words hung in the air, carrying a silent warning. David knew Anna was at her limit. She was hurting too, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. But instead of responding with understanding or trying to fix things, he felt the old resistance rising. "And what do you want me to do? Forgive that man. Forget everything he did. I want you to live, David." The words came out almost as a scream, her eyes filling with tears. "I want you to stop letting the past control you, because this anger, this bitterness, it's not hurting him anymore, but it's destroying us. You're here, but it's like you're as far away as he was, and I don't know how much longer I can wait for you to come back to us." David's breathing grew heavy. He looked at the front door as if he wanted to run, but he knew there was nowhere to go. The truth was that he was lost, trapped in a web of memories and emotions he couldn't unravel. "I don't know how to do that, Anna. I don't know how to forgive, and I don't know how to get rid of this." She took a step back, the tears rolling down her cheeks silently. "Then find a way, David. Please. Because if you don't, one day, when you look back, you'll see that you lost more than just a father." Anna turned and left the kitchen, leaving David alone. He stood there, feeling the weight of her words settle on his shoulders, dragging him into an even darker place. Her pain, her disappointment, it was all a reflection of his own feelings when he was a child. He moved closer to the window and saw Sophie playing alone. She was building a dollhouse on the lawn, talking quietly to herself. Every movement was delicate and careful, but at the same time the loneliness of the scene crushed him. What was he doing? Why was it so hard to cross the kitchen and go outside? The image of his daughter waiting just as he had waited solidified in his mind. A voice whispered inside him, almost inaudible, "You're not good enough. You'll never be." And at that moment David realized that the anger he held wasn't just pushing away the father who had abandoned him. It was pushing away the only family he still had. David came home later than usual. The clock on the wall showed it was almost 10 at night, and the house was wrapped in an oppressive silence. He tossed his keys onto the table in the living room, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him. His head throbbed, and all he wanted was to collapse on the couch and forget life for a few hours. However, as he looked around, something seemed out of place. The usual hallway light that Anna always left on for him wasn't there, and Sophie's toys weren't scattered across the floor like they normally were. Everything seemed empty. A tightness grew in his chest as he climbed the stairs to the bedroom. When he opened the door, he found the room unusually tidy, as if it were being prepared for someone else. Anna's drawers were open, with only a few pieces of clothing left inside. The bed was made, her side completely empty. A sense of despair crept up his spine like an icy chill. He rushed to the closet, yanking the doors open. Anna's and Sophie's clothes were gone. David's heart raced. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and answers he didn't want to face. He stumbled down the stairs, almost tripping, and entered the kitchen. That's when he saw it, a small envelope on the table. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope and found a hastily written note. David, I went to my parents' house with Sophie. I love you, but I can't keep going like this. You need to resolve this before it destroys all three of us. I can't let Sophie grow up feeling what you feel. I'm doing this because I still believe there's a chance for us. Please find a way to let go of the past before it takes everything away from you. Anna. David read the note over and over, unable to believe it. Anna was gone. She had taken Sophie. The weight of those words hit him so hard that he sank into the nearest chair, the paper trembling in his hands. Part of his mind told him she'd be back, that this was temporary, but another part, the rational part, knew he had crossed a line. His chest tightened, and for the first time in a long time, tears welled up unexpectedly. He pressed his fists against his eyes, trying to hold them back, but it was useless. The image of Anna and Sophie leaving the house, the packed bags, Sophie asking why Daddy wasn't coming with them, it devastated him. I lost my family, he whispered to himself, his voice breaking under the weight of the pain. But the anger was there too, pulsing like a wounded animal. This isn't my fault, he thought, trying to convince himself. I was trying to protect them. I was trying to be strong. Yet even to him, those words sounded hollow. Because deep down he knew he was lying. He knew his absence wasn't protection, but escape. He knew that instead of being the father Sophie needed, he was becoming the version of himself he despised the most. He looked at the note again, feeling the anger and fear blend together. His gaze fell on a family photo hanging on the wall. In it, he, Anna, and Sophie were smiling at a park, his arms wrapped around both of them, their faces lit by the sunlight. It was a happy image from a time when he still believed he could give them everything they needed. What had he done? How had he let things get to this point? The echo of the past reverberated in his mind. His father's face, the distant voice saying he'd be back soon, the empty promise that he could still feel weighing on his chest. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He picked up his phone, thinking of calling Anna, telling her that everything would be okay, that he would change. But he couldn't. What would he say? That he'd forgive his father? That he'd let go of the past? He didn't know how to do that. The hatred he felt had rooted itself so deeply within him that it had become a part of who he was. He dropped the phone on the table and left the house with no destination in mind, just wanting to escape from himself. David wandered aimlessly through the city streets, the nightlights passing by him like distorted shadows. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. Each step was heavy, as if he were carrying an invisible burden. He remembered the letter he had torn up the day before. His father's words echoed like a curse he couldn't shake off. "I'd like to see you before it's too late." David stopped suddenly on the sidewalk, looking into a brightly lit storefront. In the reflection, he saw a tired, defeated man with slumped shoulders and a face that looked much older than it was. He closed his eyes and shook his head. A bitter thought surfaced. If I never forgive him, what will I be? A man who protects his dignity, or a man who couldn't save his own family? His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his trance. When he looked, it was a message from his mother. "David, we need to talk. Your father is very sick. Please think about it." It was the last thing he wanted to hear. Not after losing Anna and Sophie. David returned home well after midnight. He was exhausted, but his mind was racing. He walked in and the silence welcomed him back, suffocating and oppressive. Anna's letter was still on the table. He picked it up again and read it one more time. "Before it's too late. You need to let go of the past." The words seemed to mock him. That's when he noticed another letter on the counter, one he hadn't seen before. The handwriting was familiar, and for a second, David hesitated to touch it. It seemed like the mere presence of that piece of paper cast a shadow over his home. He opened it carefully. "David, I don't know if you'll want to read this. I don't even know if you'll want to speak to me again. But I had to try. I am sick, much sicker than I want to admit. I know I made mistakes, and I know I can't turn back time. I just wanted you to know that I regret it every single day. And even though I don't deserve it, I would like to be able to apologize face to face. If not for me, do it for yourself. Don't let what I did destroy your life too." David felt the anger rise like a wave. He crumpled the letter, the paper crackling under his fingers, before throwing it to the ground. He didn't need this, he didn't want this, but Anna's voice echoed in his mind. "For yourself, David. Do it for yourself." His breathing grew heavier. He looked at the crumpled letter on the floor and then at the family photo. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had nowhere left to run. David parked his car in the hospital lot, his hands still trembling slightly as he turned off the engine. He looked up at the massive concrete building in front of him and felt the weight of every word in the letter he had read the night before. Sick, regret, forgive. Each of those words seemed loaded with years of pain and broken promises. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and tried to summon the strength he needed. Anna was right. Something inside him was destroying itself more and more. Each day he allowed the anger to consume his heart, but that didn't mean he was ready to face the man who had caused all this pain. He got out of the car and walked to the hospital entrance, his heart pounding harder with each step. Fear and rage mingled within him, creating a chaotic storm in his mind. When he reached the reception desk, he murmured his father's name, almost as if he were uttering something forbidden. "Room 412 on the second floor," the receptionist informed him. David merely nodded and climbed the stairs. Each step felt like he was walking towards a part of himself he had avoided all his life. When he finally stopped in front of the room, he didn't know what to do. His hand hovered over the doorknob, but he hesitated. "I don't have to do this," he thought. "I can leave right now and never come back. I can continue my life without this conversation." But the truth was, he didn't have a life to continue. Anna had left. Sophie was distant, and all he had was this emptiness that wouldn't let him be. With a heavy sigh, he opened the door. Inside, the man lying in the bed looked like a shadow of the father David remembered. Pale skin, thinning gray hair, sunken, weak eyes. David felt a tightening in his chest as he saw that frail human figure. For the first time, his father didn't seem like the giant who abandoned his family, but just an old, broken man. His father's eyes opened slowly, blinking as if struggling to see clearly. When he finally saw David, his lips formed a faint smile. "David, you came." His voice was barely a whisper. David stood still, his hands clenched at his sides. Everything inside him screamed to leave, but something kept him rooted in place. "Why did you call me?" he asked, his voice cold and hard. His father tried to adjust himself in bed, coughing lightly before speaking. "Because I needed to see you. Because I needed to say I'm sorry." David let out a bitter laugh. Anger bubbled up inside him, suffocating any compassion that might have been rising. "Sorry? That's what you have to say?" He took a step forward, his face contorted in a mixture of pain and fury. "Do you think saying sorry is enough to fix what you did? To erase years of absence, empty promises of abandoning me?" His father lowered his gaze, his frail shoulders shrinking even more. "I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. More than I can imagine. I didn't want to leave, David. I just didn't want to." David interrupted, his voice rising. "Didn't want to. You left. Just like that. You left me waiting at school for hours thinking something terrible had happened. And then you disappeared. Never called again, never cared to check on me. And now, after all this time, you come asking for forgiveness. Why now? Why not before?" Tears welled up in David's eyes, but he ignored them. He needed to say everything that had been trapped in his heart. "I waited for you for so long. Waited for you to come back, to pick me up, to keep even one promise. But you never came back. And now I'm the one who doesn't know how to love, how to trust. Because you taught me that trusting others only leads to pain." His father reached out, trying to touch David's hand, but he pulled away, stepping back. "I'm sorry," the man whispered, his voice faltering. "I was weak. A coward. I ran away because I thought I couldn't be a good father. I thought you'd be better off without me, but I realized I ran away from my responsibilities, and I left you to carry the weight of it." David shook his head, feeling his anger falter slightly. The pain in his father's eyes was palpable, but he couldn't bring himself to feel pity. He had fed on hatred for so long that now he didn't know how to let it go. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he confessed in a whisper. His father closed his eyes for a moment, tears rolling down slowly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that if I were in your shoes, I wouldn't forgive me either. But I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for you. So you don't live with the burden I've lived with." David felt his throat tighten. He turned away, unable to look at his father. "You want me to forgive you so I feel better? Like it's that simple? It's not simple." His father's voice was barely a murmur. "But holding on to resentment will destroy you. It destroyed me. And I see it happening to you." A heavy silence fell over the room. David felt a knot in his chest, something he couldn't unravel. The anger was still there, but now it seemed mixed with sadness and guilt. Maybe his father was right. Maybe the resentment was eating away at him from the inside. He took a deep breath and approached the bed, looking at the man who, despite everything, was still his father. "If you think just saying sorry will make me forget everything, but you're wrong, but I'll try." The words came out with effort, as if every syllable cost him dearly. His father smiled faintly, his expression full of gratitude. "Trying is a start, David. Trying is more than I could ask for." David nodded, feeling the weight on his shoulders lighten, even if just a little. He wasn't ready to forgive, but maybe he was ready to try to understand. He turned to leave, but before stepping out of the room, he looked back. "Fatim, I'll come back tomorrow. Maybe we can talk more." His father nodded, a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. David left the hospital, feeling lighter, yet still confused. Maybe forgiveness wasn't the end of the road, but the beginning of a long process, a process that in the end might set him free. David walked into the hospital room the next day, feeling a little less tense than he had the day before, but still carrying a jumble of conflicting emotions. He had spent a sleepless night, replaying the conversation with his father over and over again. Anna's and his father's words echoed in his mind like a mantra he couldn't escape. "Forgiving isn't for him, it's for you." His father was sitting up, propped against some pillows, gazing out the window when David entered. He turned slowly and gave a weak but genuine smile. "David, I thought you weren't coming back." David closed the door behind him and nodded slowly. "I thought about not coming back, but I realized that if I didn't, I'd stay trapped in the same cycle forever. So, I'm here." His father nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "That means more to me than you could ever know. Thank you for taking this step." David sat down in the chair beside the bed, feeling a growing discomfort. He didn't know how to start the conversation, how to express himself, but something inside him told him he needed to try. "I didn't come here to pretend everything's fine. I didn't come to forget what happened, but I need to understand. I need to know why. What made you leave?" His father sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. I was a coward, David. I was afraid of failing, afraid of not being the father and husband you deserved. So when things started to fall apart at work and financially, I felt powerless. I felt like I was dragging all of you down with me, and I ran away. I thought it would be easier if I just disappeared, if I cut the problem off at the root. But it was a mistake. I was selfish and weak. David absorbed those words, feeling a mixture of anger and understanding. Tears threatened to spill, but he blinked them away, trying to keep his composure. "You thought leaving was better for us. How could you think that?" His father tilted his head, his eyes filled with pain. "I was young and stupid. I thought you'd be better off without a broken father, without a failed husband. But the truth is, I was only thinking about myself, about how I felt. Only later did I realize that what I left behind was a son who believed in me, who waited for me, and that I broke you in a way I never intended." David looked down at his hands, feeling his anger mix with sadness. It was hard to hear, hard to face that the man he had hated for so long was just human, with flaws and weaknesses like his own. "I spent years trying to be everything you weren't, only to realize that I was becoming just like you." His father raised his hand and placed it on David's. The touch was light, but it carried a sincerity David didn't expect. "You're so much more than I ever was, David. You're strong. And if you're here today, it's because you have the courage to face your demons. Something I never had." A heavy silence fell between them, but it wasn't the silence of before. It was as if, for the first time, the emptiness was being filled with something different. A mutual understanding, an acceptance of who they were and what couldn't be changed. I want to try to forgive, but I don't know how," David confessed, his voice thick with painful honesty. His father smiled faintly, his face lined with the weight of time and guilt. "The first step is this, David, wanting to. The rest will happen with time. I don't expect you to forgive me now or ever forget. I just don't want you to destroy yourself because of what I did, because I've already destroyed myself enough for both of us." David looked at his father, and for the first time since he was a child, he saw a fragile, regretful man. He saw someone who had made mistakes and lived with their consequences. And in that moment, the anger began to weaken. It didn't disappear, but it lost its grip, leaving room for something new, something that could, perhaps one day, become peace. He stood up slowly and took a step towards the bed. Without a word, he leaned in and embraced his father hesitantly. His father gasped, surprised, but quickly returned the hug tightly. "I'm not going to say I forgive you, but I'll try, because I need to do this for me." His father nodded, tears now falling freely. "That's all I could ask for, David. Just try." David released his father and left the room, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He hadn't fully forgiven, but the first step had been taken. He felt lighter, more capable of facing what lay ahead. He picked up his phone and dialed Anna's number. His heart pounded as he waited for her to answer. When he heard her voice on the other end, emotion flooded him. "David." Anna's voice was cautious but filled with concern. "Anna, I went to see my father, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm trying. I'm trying to forgive." The silence that followed was long, but he could imagine her expression on the other end. That's good, David. That's a start." He took a deep breath, the tension in his body easing slightly. "Can I see you? Talk to you and Sophie." Anna hesitated. "Do you think you're ready for that? I don't want you to come to us out of obligation." "It's not an obligation, Anna. I realize that if I don't do this, I'll lose you for good. I can't let the past destroy us. I want to try." She sighed, and David could hear the relief in her voice. "Then come. We're at my parents' house. I think Sophie would be happy to see you." David smiled, the first genuine smile in a long time. "Thank you, Anna, for not giving up on me. I'm on my way." He hung up the phone and glanced at the hospital one last time. There was a lot of work to do. It wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to fight for it. David arrived at his in-laws' house and found Anna in the yard, watching Sophie play with a puppy he didn't recognize. When Sophie saw him, her eyes lit up and she ran towards him, her laughter filling the air. "Daddy!" David picked her up, hugging her tightly, tears streaming freely now. "I'm here, Sophie. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." He looked at Anna, who stood a few steps away. David knew there was much to repair, but at that moment, holding his daughter in his arms, he knew he was finally on the right path. Anna gave a small smile and a nod, as if to say she believed in that too. David hugged Sophie once more, feeling something new bloom inside him. Hope. 6 months had passed since David decided to try to forgive his father. Sitting in the backyard of their new home, he watched Sophie play with the puppy they had recently adopted. His daughter's smile was a reflection of everything he hadn't known he needed. Each of her giggles filled his heart with a warmth he thought he had lost forever. Anna appeared beside him, carrying 2 cups of tea. She sat on the bench next to him, watching Sophie as well. The silence that settled between them was comfortable. It wasn't the heavy, resentful silence of the past, but a peaceful one, full of mutual understanding. "She's so happy," Anna murmured, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "And I think you are too." David nodded, his gaze still fixed on their daughter. "Yes. I am, Anna. I know that. I still have a lot to learn and a lot to make up for, but—" He took a deep breath, turning to her with a look full of sincerity. "But I'm here, really here this time, and that's a start, right?" She placed her hand over his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Yes, it's a start, and it's all we needed." David thought back to the past few months, the visits he had made to the hospital, the painful conversations, and finally, the farewell to his father. Reconciliation hadn't been a quick or easy process, but each encounter had helped him release a bit more of the burden he had been carrying. In the end, he was able to say the words he never thought he'd be able to. "I forgive you, Dad." His father had passed away a few days later. His face, serene, seemed at peace. And as David left the hospital that last day, he felt the bitterness fade away, replaced by a sense of freedom he hadn't known existed. Anna noticed his distant expression and squeezed his hand again. "Are you thinking about him?" David blinked, coming back to the present. "Yes. And no. I'm thinking about how forgiveness changes everything. It doesn't bring back lost time. It doesn't erase the pain, but it brings peace. It gives you the chance to move forward without drowning in the past." Anna smiled, her gaze filled with understanding and affection. "And that's what matters most, David. You did what you needed to do, and now you can move on. We can move on." David turned to her, a shy smile on his lips. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for believing I could change." She shrugged, her eyes glistening slightly with unshed tears. "It was hard, but you're worth it." David felt his heart warm. He put his arm around her and pulled her close, resting his head against hers. Being there, sitting in the backyard, watching his daughter play, was more than he could have asked for. It was a miracle that only happened because he finally had the courage to face his own pain and accept that he needed to let go of the past. Sophie ran over to them, her face flushed from the sun and her eyes sparkling with joy. "Daddy, Mommy, come play with me." David smiled and glanced at Anna, who nodded, encouraging him to go. He stood up, lifting Sophie in his arms and twirling her around in the air. Her laughter filled the air, and he felt his own laughter bubbling up, a sensation of lightness and happiness, unlike anything he had felt before. As he played with Sophie, he saw Anna join them. The three of them lay down on the grass, the puppy running around them, and David realized that this was the kind of moment worth fighting for. He looked up at the sky, the words from Ephesians 4:31-32 echoing in his mind as a constant reminder. "Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you." He had gotten rid of the bitterness. He was learning to be kind and compassionate, and for the first time in a long while, he felt he could finally forgive, not just his father but himself. And with that, he could rebuild everything he had lost. The sun slowly set on the horizon, and David turned to Anna and Sophie, his heart full of gratitude and hope. "I promise you both, I'll never let the past come between us again. We'll build something new together." Anna smiled, and Sophie let out a squeal of delight, pulling him back into another game. David knew the path ahead was still long, but he was ready to walk it. And this time he wasn't alone. With the sound of his daughter's laughter and the warmth of Anna's embrace, he knew he had finally found what he had been searching for all along: peace.